Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the war of words on the U.S. airwaves.
Waterboarding violates our ideals and our values.
I think those programs were absolutely essential to the success we enjoyed.
And the tortured language of the media.
Harsh CIA interrogation methods.
The Russian billionaire and the elite social network that has taken snobbery on board and online. The posthumous video that goes viral in Guatemala, in which a murder victim accuses the country's leader of having him killed. And The Sound of Music takes over a train station in Belgium. We begin this broadcast with a story about torture. However, if we were doing this show on certain U.S. news networks or writing about this issue in an American newspaper, our lead line would have been different. We would be introducing a story on enhanced interrogation techniques. The debate occurring in American media on torture is not really about what was done to the people in U.S. jails, be they in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Guantanamo Bay. A large part of the discussion is about terminology and why important U.S. news outlets such as the New York Times still cannot bring themselves to say, as even President Obama has said, that waterboarding is in fact torture. That's our starting point this week: torture, the Orwellian language of the U.S. news media, and how the so-called war on terror continues to prevent American journalists from telling it like it is.
The Obama Justice Department today released documents that lay out in stark detail the interrogation methods used by the Bush administration.
Do you believe torture took place?
You know, I don't know what I think about waterboarding. I think waterboarding is pretty close to the line.
It is far from clear whether that technique qualifies under the law as torture.
The debate itself is about the definition of torture.
We could have a long argument about what torture is.
Prisoner abuse.
Rough treatment of some al-Qaeda suspects.
The media coverage of the torture debate remains so simplistic.
Burning at the stake is torture. Boiling in oil is torture.
It's a huge mistake when the U.S. press chooses not to call torture for what it is.
Alleged mistreatment of prisoners by U.S. personnel.
Of course, that ends up serving the ends of the people who are supporting the torture regime.
One of the first lessons reporters are ever taught in Journalism 101 is to consider the source. In the torture debate, the primary source on waterboarding was the Bush administration, which authorized it and said it was not torture.
The techniques were necessary and are necessary to be used on a rare occasion to get information necessary to protect the American people.
Then came the Obama administration, which calls waterboarding torture and has therefore banned it.
Waterboarding violates our ideals and our values. I do believe that it is torture.
So where does that leave the media?
Traditionally, what the media does is it looks at a definition, sees whose interest it's in to use that definition, then finds out whether the facts of the case meet that definition.
In this case, the experts on interrogation are the people who interrogate. If you go to those interrogators and you ask them, do these techniques work? Are they torture? Overwhelmingly, you hear the same thing. Yes, waterboarding, these extreme tactics are torture. But for some reason, in this debate, the media, doesn't do that. They trust the word of politicians with virtually no experience in any of this to make the case that this isn't torture. It really does a disservice to the debate and skews it in a way to make it unintelligible.
Certainly one help in defining what is and what is not torture is the Red Cross, which looked into a lot of the activity at the rendition sites and claimed that by their definition that this indeed was torture. And it seems to me if anybody is in a position to dispassionately adjudicate whether something is or is not torture, the Red Cross has a long history at being able to do so.
What is stopping so many American news outlets from using the T word? Part of it comes down to the editorial policy of the country's most influential newspaper.
All journalists still take their cues from the New York Times. At first, they called them harsh interrogation techniques. Just recently, they changed the term that they use to brutal interrogation techniques, which is a little stronger, but they still don't refer to it as torture. What they'll often say is what some people call torture. They'll find different ways like that to get the word in without calling it.
The Times has actually written about the issue. Its public editor, Clark Hoyt, quoted the Times' Washington editor, Douglas Gell, who said, "Exactly what constitutes torture continues to be a matter of debate and hasn't been resolved by a court." This president and this attorney general say waterboarding is torture, but the previous president and attorney general said it is not. On what basis should a newspaper render its own verdict, short of charges being filed or a legal judgment being rendered? That line of argument resulted in waves of criticism, including this acidic response in a letter to the editor. The Times would not call bank robbery a brutal cash-gathering technique, even if a president said it was so.
This is the same sort of softball journalism that we've seen all too often in the U.S. press. It's a big reason why the U.S. public was led blindly into war in Iraq, and very often does not get the kind of hard-hitting, critical journalism that our democracy or any democracy requires.
The debate at the New York Times has echoed across American airwaves as the torture story unfolds.
American military people abusing prisoners.
Former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was media shy while in office, has suddenly found his voice.
I think those programs were absolutely essential to the success we enjoyed of being able to collect the intelligence that led us to defeat all further attempts to launch attacks against the United States since 9/11.
And Cheney's surrogates have also come out in force in the media, justifying the Bush administration's use of torture.
If you knew that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had information about an imminent threat on the United States, information that would result in the death of your family members, the death of people that you care about and love, and that if he were waterboarded, you would be able to get that information and prevent the attack, you wouldn't do it?
We hadn't heard from Dick Cheney in a while, and then he popped up to say that the torture techniques yielded the significant intelligence and stopped attacks. So you saw a bunch of different people from the Bush administration publishing op-eds in major newspapers. When you actually looked at their claims, though, a lot of them just turned out to be bogus.
Case in point, a recent article on the Daily Beast website, backed up by an aide to former Secretary of State Colin Powell. Both said that in 2003, torture was used primarily not to prevent attacks, but to establish links between Iraq and al-Qaeda to justify the war. There were no such links.
It's ghastly to look at the timeline because you see they captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed on March 1st. The invasion was 3 weeks later, and in between, they waterboarded him 183 times, and at least part of that was to get information about this fabricated Iraq al-Qaeda connection.
However, that story went almost nowhere. Media Matters, a liberal media watchdog site, reported that 5 days after the story broke, none of the 5 major American newspapers, including the New York Times, considered that news fit to print.
This is the main problem with the U.S. media, is that we've got a media system that is run, for the most part, at the commercial levels by people who are afraid to challenge power, take the gloves off, and really find out what's happening. Hopefully we'll see some changes as the media landscape in the United States divests from the mainstream major networks, moves online, and we see more independent critical voices.
What we're talking about is waterboarding.
And until that happens, you can expect to hear more tortured language,
harsh CIA interrogation methods,
more enhanced euphemistic techniques,
the mistreatment and abuse of prisoners
from the American media. Here's how our Global Village voices see the U.S. media's reporting of torture under the Bush administration.
Is it wrong for President Obama to withhold the photos of prisoners being tortured by American soldiers? Of course it's wrong. It's wrong for several reasons. Forget about the moral implications of what was done and the right of the public to know, which is a fundamental basis of justice in the United States. Think about what it might do to perceptions of the United States in other countries.
The torture photos are a chance for the United States to be open and honest to the world about the realities at Guantanamo Bay. And the release of these photos is an opportunity for President Obama to address this issue differently than how the previous Bush administration did. On the second day of his presidency, Obama promised that he would hold himself to a new standard of openness, yet he is hesitant to directly confront the situation.
The sad part about this debate, though, is that we're focused on the photographs of torture. The reality is the torture itself, not the photographs, is the immoral, unethical conduct that needs to come to an end.
Looking to be one of our Global Village voices? There are 3 ways to go about that. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net, or you can go the Facebook route by looking for the Listening Post page there. You can also follow us on Twitter. We promise to let you know via Facebook or Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program. And you can also use any of those 3 methods to send us your ideas for what should be our Internet Video of the Week. Some quick hits from the world of media now. Listening Post News Bites. There's a video that's gone viral in Guatemala, and so many people are watching it there that it has crashed some overwhelmed servers in the country. It was first played at the funeral of a lawyer who was shot to death recently in Guatemala City. In the video, he points the finger at who he says was responsible for his death.
Y lamentablemente, si usted está en este momento oyendo y viendo este mensaje, es porque fui asesinado por el señor presidente Álvaro Colón.
Mr. Marzano said he made the video because he knew his life was in danger since he had represented 2 Guatemalan businessmen who accused President Colom of large-scale corruption. The president has denied the charge, saying his conscience is clear. Protesters who got organized through Facebook have marched through Guatemala City demanding that their president step down. Here's a story about the flip side of the Facebook and social networking phenomenon. The Simon Wiesenthal Center has just put out a report detailing how the internet is being used by hate groups to further their aims. The report identifies some 10,000 troublesome hate websites and says that the most targeted groups are Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Hindus, gays, women, and immigrants. And the report says extremist views are growing fastest on Facebook. The Wiesenthal Center says that on the web, where all users are created equal with no top-down editorial control, expressions of hate can flow unchallenged. Radio France International has been momentarily silenced by a series of strikes. Journalists and technicians are not happy with President Nicolas Sarkozy's planned reforms of French media, part of which calls for RFI to merge with 2 of the country's main television stations. Such a plan would mean the elimination of 1/5 of all jobs at RFI, which currently employs about 1,000 people. Radio France International broadcasts in French and 19 other languages. 6 of those linguistic services would be eliminated if the merger goes forward. Citizen journalists operating in the blogosphere are often accused of plagiarizing, even cutting and pasting material from the mainstream media. Here's a case of the shoe being on the other foot. New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd wrote this paragraph recently on the subject of torture. Turns out the exact same graph had appeared on a U.S. political site called TalkingPointsMemo.com 3 days earlier. Bloggers picked up on that. Dowd apologized, but claimed that she had never read the original entry. She insisted she was told the line by a friend of hers, who she assumed was being spontaneous. It'll be interesting to see how the Times, which has a strict no plagiarism policy, deals with the issue. Memo to the White House press corps: be sure to turn off your mobile phone when you enter the briefing room. President Obama's press secretary, Robert Gibbs, does not like to be interrupted by those annoying ringtones, and he lost patience recently when a reporter's phone rang during one of his briefings.
Give me the phone.
So Gibbs confiscated the phone and exiled it to a back room. The journalist was allowed to stay. But moments later, another reporter, Bill Plant of CBS News, got a call, and Gibbs wanted his phone as well, but Plant fled the room rather than hand over the handset. Plant and many of his colleagues have been around for a while, and they know politics a bit better than technology. Somebody might want to clue them in to the fact that mobile phones have a silence setting. We're back after the break with a report on a new Russian network aimed at snobs.